Dr. Mike Benbough-Jackson is a senior lecturer of modern British history at Liverpool's John Moores University. He has published a number of topics, and he has always had an interest in the strange and the unusual, and is currently writing an article on sea monsters between the world wars. And his New Year's resolution is to see an ABC, an alien big cat. Those cats that appear to be prowling across the fields and the streets of the UK have yet to be seen by any journalists, as it were, and has evidence yet to be put out there. But Mike is insistent on making this happen. It is his New Year's resolution. And so if you have any of those accounts, if you know where there's a big cat, let Mike know, and he wants to come and see it. So, without further ado, Mike Benbough-Jackson, step up to the plate, and welcome very much to the ASSAP webinar here today on the 16th of January.
Many thanks, Christian, and many thanks, Caroline. Just before we started talking, it was incredible how much I've learned already just about alien, strange beings and creatures in the fields, and also UAPs. It's a great organisation to be part of. Right, let's introduce some more strange things then. I'll put a share my screen. Christian guided me through this earlier, so it should work okay. There we have it. I've added a lot of H's there, everyone. Sorry, the title has been fluctuating. I've moved it a great deal because I added another case study. It was going to be exclusively about the hairy man scare in Lisbon, Northern Ireland. But then I fell upon something from Penarth a couple of years later in Glamorganshire, so I combined them both. Hopefully, it won't be to the detriment of either study. I've gone in quite deep into both of these, and while I was looking into them, I found another two, then another couple, and I thought I better stop here and just focus on Penarth and Lisbon. As you can see, I didn't really know what to call this. These are hairy men, a gorilla in one case, possibly. It just really doesn't seem very clear. I put things like hominid there, as indicating primates, hairy humans, humanoids, hallucinations. I just went all alliteration crazy there, a little bit too much, I think. But hopefully it'll become a bit clearer as we go along this evening, because this is topical. This is recent article from the Daily Star referring to Cambridge sightings, 2 sightings in Cambridge. One case he was 6 foot. I say he, I don't know him that well. And the other case, it was quite shorter than the average man, according to the other witness. These hairy manimals, to call it, have been with us for some time. And indeed, we know legends in North America and so forth. We know that these are not particularly restricted to the early 1890s, the 2 examples I'll be looking at this evening. So they've been part of our psyche for a while, and they are one of the archetypes of the strange figures that we are interested in. We're going on a cryptid hunt. I'm going to call them cryptids. I'm going to simplify, but we're going on a cryptid hunt. And this involves looking into the past. So the materials that are available are clearly not going to be photographic at this stage anyway. They could have been, but they weren't. They're not going to be interviews. But it's surprising how much you can find and how much is still out there, which is always very exciting, I find, because I just think, oh, well, maybe if I go there, maybe if I look there, it just keeps on going. But I just draw a line somewhere for the purposes tonight. So this is what we're going to do. Some preliminaries, looking at the objectives, a brief typology, many of which you'll be familiar with. Then talk about the context of the early 1890s, because I think that's important to get a feel for the world in which people were living in that time. Then the 2 case studies, Lisbon and Penarth, respectively, both in a bit of detail. And finally, are we any closer? And I'm going to conclude with a couple of points that will hopefully be of interest to or helpful for everybody looking into any topic, because when you're looking into things so specific as this, you do draw out general conclusions at times and reflections on what is happening. And yeah, hopefully it'll round it off in a way that will be of interest to people who may not be particularly interested in hairy men. When I mentioned to my wife I was looking into hairy men, she's a bit perturbed. But to be honest, I mean, I could qualify as one myself if I just don't shave for a few days. So I may feel some kind of common ground with these figures, although maybe not the example there on the right of the screen. So if you're looking for evidence from the 1890s, you are not really at that much of a disadvantage because that is the time of the new journalism, as it was called by Matthew Arnold. The term was coined in the 1880s. You got a substantial increase in the press. It was called the yellow press as well. And indeed, when I've heard people talk about the airship scares in the USA and the sightings in the 1890s, they often refer to this type of newspaper as being a very important source for these stories. And because of the extension in the readership and the kind of readership, the range of newspapers, it's really beneficial if you're looking for strange things. I've got to say, the pejorative terminology of Matthew Arnold way back in 1887, yeah, of course, you can have some real fabulous things there and things that we may deem trivial. But overall, you get something that you don't get from the press, say, well, you get less from the press in the 1850s and earlier. You still get some strange nuggets then. But by the end of the 19th century, you start hitting quite a few seams, rich seams that you can examine. What were these? That's the first thing we want to look at in each case is what were these? It's a strange case of establishing the reality. Yeah. What were they? Because they both caused a significant amount of concern and distress. They were both reported as having rampaging through gardens or in fields, destroying crops, and other things we'll get to. Secondly, there's just two main aims really, is establishing the responses to the sightings and the reports of these things. We can get into the mindset of the times, and this is where we enter a territory that is, I suppose, anthropological in many ways. And irrespective of what these things were, we want to work out what they meant and how they were seen. So, in sum, and there's a bit of my philosophy there, odd events tell us a great deal about everything, and that applies to the past and the present. They attract attention. They intrude into people's lives. They impose themselves and demand attention, whether that's rebuffing and dismissal or debunking, or whether that's some kind of engagement with them. There really is some value in looking at these particular incursions into people's lives, and the place you find them is in the press. So, obviously you're aware of many of you are aware of different kinds of weird hairy things. I've got one of them wandering around now. I had to mute myself earlier because he was demanding something from me. Siamese cats are very, very vocal, and he's half Siamese, which means he's quite vocal. Moving up, really, we see from the more extreme examples, you could argue, you've got the paranormal Harrys. There could be ghosts, a bit like the Sheffield Union Canal man monkey, as some define that particular cryptid as a ghost. You can go along the elemental route, and you can go along any of those others. I call them hairy fairies. You could think of them as being an unknown, yet discovered animal, creature, much as Bigfoot is seen or the Yowie. It could be a known animal that's out of place, or it could simply be a very hairy person, a vagrant, or maybe a hermit. And there are a fair number of those around at this time and other times too. I suppose looking at the Woodrows there, we see a classic figure that we see in medieval imagery. And funny enough, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, the story refers to Woodrows as being around in Wirral, which is where I'm based. So I may not have seen any alien black cats here, but hopefully I might see a Woodrows. But then perhaps I don't really want to. Those clubs look pretty dangerous. They're kind of like fawn-like as well, animals. There's that kind of the legendary figures, the satyr and the fawn come into this too. Sometimes the Woodrows just pose a problem. It kind of lots of different meanings, and it's not my place here to delve into that. I'm not a medievalist. I'm a modern British historian, but it is a useful point of reference to what we're going to look at today. Now, let's look at the context then of the 1892 was the first sighting, 1894 was the second. We really have to appreciate how progress was visible at this time. We have progress today, obviously, in various technological means, and it is visible quite closely to us. But here we have great structural transformations taking place. And I've listed some there, as you can see, involved in engineering or transportation, and also leisure, in the case of Blackpool. In terms of literature, we have the serialization and then the publication in book form of Jungle Book. Now, I'm not going to suggest there's a causal relationship between Jungle Book and the sighting of hairy individuals, but I am going to point out that it's a reminder of the connection between an empire and the world around it, which it defined itself against. So it's something maybe to bear in mind when we come to these, what might something primitive and wild represent in the eyes of the people of the time. Quite eventful in Ireland, with the efforts at Home Rule stalling and then being aborted. We've got quite a bit of politics going on in terms of the formation of the early days of Labour Party, exciting developments regarding women's property rights in marriage, and the great horse manure scare, which something which is sounds quite Fortean in many ways. But it was that year that many concerns were voiced that there were so many horses being used in urban areas, and of course urban areas were expanding at an incredible rate, that we would end up, they speculated, being under a substantial amount of horse manure sooner or later, such was the requirement in terms of transportation. And of course, doesn't take long before the car starts emerging, just in time to save us from being, well, covered in horse poo. So, case one, we need to get an idea of what people felt and what people thought, and those examples give us an idea of what the world they lived in, albeit briefly. Lisbon is quite a liminal town. It straddles, well, it's on one side, in Antrim, but it kind of spills over part of it to County Down. It's very close to its neighbour. That's as far as the crow flies. It's not by road, or by road it's always longer in most of these estimates. It's on river, quite prosperous in many regards, with its industries, linen manufacture. It's got a Protestant population, but not so much a Scottish, Irish, Northern Irish population, but one that came over from England and Wales, and of course the addition of the Huguenots, the French Protestants, about 1698. Those newspapers are invaluable because you've got two substantial papers covering the area, and that meant that as well as the reports about this hairy man, I get to read letters that are sent in about the hairy man scare. Now that really brought it to life for me, and that made me think, oh, there's something in here that I could take further. The papers themselves talk about it to some extent, at some length, speculating about what it could be or what it was, talking about the mood of the public. There's quite a bit of content there for something that is so kind of peculiar. And it came on my radar about 6 months or so ago, and I was looking for other things, and I thought, yeah, this might bring some more results. And it did over time. Found quite a bit more about it. So for each of these examples, I'm going to have one slide that describes what I call the intruder. I think that's a useful term because calling it a manimal or a hairy creature, yeah, they're hairy, but they intrude. They enter these areas and they create havoc. Even if they're not real, they create havoc in people's minds. These are quotes from letters and both newspapers. You get the idea from them, the range. The first one refers to it in the broad sense. It became known as the Lisbon Hairy Man Scare or the Strawberry Hill Scare. And we have having some maps later that'll identify that area, the other side of the River Lardon. Modern Esau, of course, a reference to Isaac's Bible. The very hairy and the outdoor, one of Isaac's sons, called a foreigner, called the wonder, called the unknown, called an extraordinary animal. You can imagine how excited I was when I was reading these. I was thinking, oh, this is this. At first, I thought, here we are, we've got a Bigfoot, monstrosity. And what really piqued my interest was this remark about some of the responses. Not a few thinking the appearance is supernatural. Now, the term foreigner was used 200, 300 years earlier before this time to describe anybody from outside. They needn't be that far away. They're not necessarily from another country. But these descriptions kind of go from a man, albeit a biblical figure, through to an animal, and then to a monster, then possibly supernatural. It's ticking a lot of boxes here. And well, we will find out what we think it is soon. Um, in Belfast, actually, in 1892, in February, a few months before this time, there was a museum of novelties visiting. And they had the usual things there, like Wild West shows, which were on everyone's mind. They had like really corpulent individuals and so forth. But they also had something described as the wild hairy man. Now, when I saw that again, I thought, well, was he hanging around a bit afterwards? Did he decide to leave the Museum of Novelties and wander the land? I don't think so. But wild hairy men were, the wild men of Borneo. They were quite a source of entertainment, and hairy women as well. So these are the stark descriptions. But let's get into something of what went on. Okay, what did he get up to? What did it get up to? Well, nothing happened in Lisbon itself that we know of. You can see the river there, the Lagan going through, and then the Lagimore area there, the other side of the river. Nothing happened in the town itself related to this hairy man. So the area that we're interested in is slightly outside. So you can see these roads leaving the town, and it's along these that we need to move along. So these are not, it's not exactly the same scale as the last one, but I've just followed over because it's a separate county. You had to like piece together two maps. I've got to move I can't see that yet. So you see Strawberry Hill here. So that's where that's the name that was given, one of the names that was given to these incidents then. But when you look into it, it covers a far wider area. And indeed, we'll come to the owner of Upper Strawberry Hill and Strawberry Hill before long now, and their view on it all. But as you can note, you've gone from a town to lots of fields, open area, and it's mainly uphill. It goes uphill quite. One of my students comes from Lisbon, and was trying to engage them about this because I've never been there myself, and saying, is it steep there? And I was trying to get the gradients, and they're saying, yes, it's quite steep. It's all the way up the hill there. Anyway, I took their word for it and carried on. So what he's doing is wandering round the fields, ripping up vegetables, turnips and potatoes. They're the only ones that are named, and there would have been like an early crop, I think, at that time. And he was eating them in the fields. And that in itself, not only did he look strange, but behaving very strange too. Also, you're talking about property being damaged, people's property. Their crops are very important, the farmers, the farms in that area. And that's one of the reasons why the newspapers were so irritated with the hairy man. One of them recommended that he get taken into prison and get given a good haircut. That didn't happen. As far as I know, he wasn't caught. But of course, for the press, the hairy man wasn't anything supernatural. It wasn't anything monstrous. It was a hoaxer. That's their idea of what was happening. And they cited a previous event where a maidservant had dressed up in a white sheet and frightened people as a ghost. And there wasn't much more detail about that case, but it does show the way in which these strange events are kind of catalogued together when they happen in specific areas. So there he is, eating lots of crops, eating lots of early crop, and witnesses told the local police. This adds another layer to the story and some more evidence. Not so much the police records. I've contacted the archivist at Lisbon Museum and they said they couldn't help me there. And the police station in Lagimore is no longer there. But they told the police, and part of that report or part of that investigation was repeated in the press as well. So we get a little bit more detail here. And this is what happened. The chief witness was a woman in a house, in a farmhouse on her own. And the hairy man came into the farmhouse and there were potatoes there and he ate them. On seeing her, he left the house, climbed up on a haystack, sat on top of it, and ate the potatoes. That was shocking. And apparently she was so frightened she couldn't go out to milk the cows in the evening as a result of that. So the police did conduct an investigation and search the area, as did groups of local farm folk and their farm labourers and the like. Never caught him. But I just got this image of him there on top of the haystack enjoying his potatoes. It doesn't say whether they were cooked or not, because if he'd been eating raw vegetables all day, then obviously that would have been a bit of a treat for him. So the farmers, the local constabulary, all looking for him. No, they didn't find him. A letter that was published in the Lisbon Herald criticised the local police for not doing enough to apprehend this strange visitor. James Murdoch lived not that far away from Strawberry Hill, Ballantyne Road, which runs up there. That's the only address he has. So as you can see, it's across the way from there with a bit of kind of like uncultivated land there. He was very irritated. He was away when it happened, and the hairy man visited his farm and spoke to his children. So obviously we've got the ability to speak there, insulted them and used foul language. He also visited the farm in which the Murdoch's sister lived. I'm not sure if that's the same woman who reported it to the police. It's possible. But anyway, she was treated in a very, given lots of insults, apparently. That's what he says. There's nothing in detail what was said exactly. But that's what took place. A second letter in the press was from Charles Scott of Strawberry Hill Farm, who just said this thing didn't happen. He didn't see anything. Nobody in Strawberry Hill saw it. Why is it called the Strawberry Hill Scare? I just don't agree with that tag. And there we see another one of the aspects about the supernatural is that there is this desire not to be associated with it, whether you're trying to sell your house or whether you're trying to just maintain a respectable image. It doesn't do, perhaps, to have such strange stories circulating. And he gets the press has a debate with him, saying, well, something has happened because they've got the hoax theory, and there's members of the public with the supernatural or monstrosity theory. And there we have Scott with his, no, 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 it's nothing at all. Nothing to see here. What's interesting about Murdoch, who was the letter I mentioned earlier, who was complaining about the police, was that his children at the time, there's no Irish census, well, there's aggregate data for 1891, but the detailed information is not available. He was pulped during the First World War or something. That's what you were told online anyway. 1901, I worked back and they were about 9 and 13 at the time. So that gives you an idea of perhaps why Murdoch was so angry that he wasn't there. After his children had been, well, offended, maybe threatened. But there's the first clue there, isn't it? This monstrosity can obviously string a few words together, albeit offensive. So this consequence, we have the denial, the hoax theory, the old ghost stories being mentioned by the press. The monstrosity in the shape of a tramp was how James Murdoch described him. Now, James didn't see him, but his children did, and his sister had. So the monstrosity in the form of a tramp. Now, well, it looks like we're getting there, doesn't it? That there's a great deal of fear and concern that this might be a hoaxer. It doesn't look like it according to Murdoch, and it doesn't seem like it's that too supernatural either. We look like vagrants being identified. And in 13th of August, a ex-policeman had been stabbed in the face by a vagrant in Lisbon itself. Now, he'd apprehended that individual, so we know that it was unlikely that the hairy man of Lisbon, as he's called, was that particular vagrant. Now, can we draw a line under it? Well, we can, I think. James Murdoch seems to provide us with the evidence in his letters that this thing spoke, and that it was a very hairy and very hungry vagrant. But that's just what the facts probably indicate. But why the supernatural association? That's what I'm going to conclude this first case study with. I went into a little bit of a journey into Irish fairy lore with this and used some images there from a book I had as a child on Irish strange mythical creatures. You can't help thinking one of three things, I thought, and maybe others will have other ideas. Um, but we've got the Fargota, the man of hunger, clearly associated with famine times primarily, which is the 1840s, sometime before this. There had been something called the Little Famine in the west of Ireland in 1879, but irrespective of its distance in time, Northern Ireland was affected as well in the 1840s. So maybe some kind of folk memory there or idea. It doesn't really stand up to much scrutiny though, because even though clearly hunger was driving this hairy man to act in the way he did, Gotta is a very spectral figure that asks for alms, can actually do good things if you are kind to him. He's very emaciated. He's not going to be getting much food. But I suppose there's room for other kinds and other types of men of hunger in people's supernatural vocabularies or their bestiaries. So that was a possibility, I suppose, in how people might have felt, because you don't get a record of those people who've got the supernatural beliefs, because the press is not going to outline them, only incidentally, dismissively, or in passing. The same is true with like the devil's hoof marks in Devon in the 1850s. I mean, there's a great deal of press attention, but they talk about the supernatural populace in a way that I suspect to some extent may be exaggerated in order to affirm their own rationality. But also, it's just frustrating that we don't necessarily get those voices, even at the time of the new journalism. There's also, moving on to the second one there, the little fellow, the Far Darrig, red clothing, because this, when they described the wild-haired man of Lisbon, he had a scarlet jacket. That's the only item of clothing that he was recorded to be wearing in the newspapers. Now, I presume he had something on his bottom half as well, but wasn't worthy of note. But the identification of the red clothing immediately, with his associations with fairy lore and so forth, made me think, so maybe this kind of gruesome leprechaun type creature, all being very small, but supposedly having this liking for red clothing. So that might have triggered something in the populace as well. Um, Trying to understand why it aroused such a degree of concern, this sighting of this individual. Finally, the Gruga. This, well, honest, the main thing about Gruga is that it means hairy or long-haired or haired one. And it can male or female. Some suggest there's a difference between the Scottish version and the Irish version, and sometimes a bit skeptical of these distinctions based on geography. But the fact is, there are definitely a lot of Grugas around. Some of them are wizard-like, some of them are like farmhands. The truth is that all three of these, with maybe the exception of the Far Darrig, are fairly, amicable in many ways, or at least follow the usual kind of routine of fairydom. You do good by us, and we'll do good by you. Whereas, well, the real monstrous hairy man didn't really seem to have those fey scruples, you could argue. Moving on to our second example now, and to slightly more familiar territory for me anyway, Southeast Wales. I don't come from there, but I spent a bit of time there. Obviously, it's where the big cities are, where all the excitement is. If you're in the west of Wales, Penarth. Those of you who know Garvin and Stacey will know of Barry, which is slightly off the map there, to the west. Also a resort like Penarth, was a rival resort at this point in the 1890s. A very prosperous place, on average, quite respectable. As you can see there, it has many of the features you'd associate with respectability in the 1890s or wealth. It's a people commute to work in Cardiff. It's very close. Uh, Golf and tennis are all the rage and very common. There's a pier being built at this very point in time in the year that it's happening, which will be opened in 1895. It has got another element to it because it's got a dock, and in the northern part of Penarth, as we'll see in the second map, is slightly less prosperous. It's only got the one paper, but we are fortunate in that Cardiff being so nearby. The Belfast Press did mention the Hairy Man once that I found so far, but Cardiff really enjoyed this visitor that came to Penarth. It was a great deal, and indeed, the editor of the Western Mail lived in Penarth at that time, so that may explain that. Western Mail, one of the biggest papers. Southwood Daily News as well, important, and the Evening Express was a crucial source as well for this. One of the frustrating things I've got to mention as an aside, a bit of it, I don't talk about inside baseball here, but the Penarth Chronicle has got a very irregular run, and I'm going to try and hunt down if there's anything in it, because I'm sure there will be. Yes, it's a prosperous place in many ways, but it's got two halves. Its rivalry with Barry in the 1890s was a major source of concern, and there's also concern that Cardiff wanted to incorporate it into Cardiff itself. So the place was gained in this in-between position, I think, at that time. And building the pier was one of the ways, of course, to kind of compete with Barry. We're very fortunate with the nearby papers paying so much attention, though, because we get some images as well. So that'll hopefully keep us interested as we move along. The Grim Visitor, that's the main name description of this figure. The intruder was described as a gorilla from the outset, but of being of abnormal size. And we'll get to the size of gorillas a bit later on. The Phantasmagoric Gorilla. That sounds like a great band name. Well, maybe an album title. Dreadful Monster of the Woods. That sounds interesting. The Hairy Midnight Marauder. We're so lucky with this new journalism. It provides us with so many words and descriptions. At least two, three, four newspapers dealing with these issues in the Cardiff area. And more broadly speaking, the Penarth Gorilla Scare or the Penarth Gorilla Mystery. Now, in the weeks and months after this scare had ended, you had performers doing skits and little pieces about the Penarth Gorilla and comedic shows about the Penarth Gorilla. And that reminded me a bit of what happened a few years after Spring Heel Jack in London, how it would become part of the entertainment scene. Of course, this gorilla is by no means as notorious or renowned as Spring Heel Jack, but he's still an intruder in the way that Spring Heel Jack was, and definitely created quite a stir and quite a bit of excitement. Some people thought he'd escaped from the Merthyr Menagerie. Now, Merthyr Tydfil is a fair distance away. It's only about 27 miles, but it's past Cardiff. It's well up to the end of a valley. So I thought that was a little bit of very unlikely. But why they should choose Merthyr Menagerie as a cause is something that again may require further investigation on my part. But it's one of the places, the only place actually that was mentioned. And there's no reference to him coming off a ship or anything along those lines that you might expect. Unlike other strange out of place creatures, frequently it's referred to an escapee from a ship or from a zoo or menagerie. So here we are in Penarth itself. These images are from 1900 thereabouts, so they're quite proximate. I've got a link here, and I'm praying to the Lord, Christian, that this will work and that it won't throw us all. Oh, no, service unavailable. Typical, isn't it? Temporary unavailable. Well, I was prepared for this. I was prepared for this. In true style, I need to go back to where it was. Hang on, there we are. We still be able to make out on the map, but it's not as ideal as I wanted. So I wanted to zoom in a little bit more closer. But there we see the dock and the buildings in this area. You can kind of make it out are more terraced-like. And when you come to this part, you can see the gardens, and this was called Villadom. in Penarth at that time. And these parts, one of them was called Daggertown. So that gives you an idea of the split in Penarth, which was based on class. So many of those in the north would have been of Irish descent, and settled in southeast Wales. And to the south, we have a very different environment indeed. And as you'll note, the pier, which I wanted to see more of, is more on the south side. All the classic telltale signs of differences in prosperity and living standards. The area where gorilla was busy was there. Again, I really wanted to zoom in closer, but there we have it. And funnily enough, the Western Mail editor lived there. Um, well, it's only a small little patch of woods, but when you're talking about a place that has grown, doubled in population in 10 years, from 1881 to 1891, these areas would have seemed all the stranger. Anything probably wooded or non-cultivated would have stood out. It's called Roger Moore Woods on the maps, but the press called it Rogmora, which is, it never ceases to amaze me, and it does when I hear news reports, how, when you've got local knowledge, how even fairly local press get things wrong, and then that inaccuracy gets repeated and repeated. So it's Roger Moore Woods. Interesting in itself, quite an amusing name, but not Rogmora. So it wreaked havoc. Okay, it wreaked havoc in this area, going and interestingly attacking gardens, tearing up gardens, damaging produce. Okay, so we've got some parallels there with the Lisbon hairy man in that respect. And of course, these are the places with the gardens. Farmers were also alarmed. Um, there are reports of pigs being killed. This is a very unusual gorilla with a meat, an interest in meat. Those do know that many herbivores do actually eat meat from time to time, don't we? Yeah, horses at times. Anyway, enough of that. We're going off on a line here. Swede field. He had a taste for Swedes. We have the turnips and the potatoes in Lisbon, but the Swedes here, and there were groups of armed men supposedly looking for him in the Swede field. We say him, we just assume. There are lots of armed groups going around. Yeah, once again, a common theme in these cases, people activating themselves, sheep being killed too. Now, it's difficult when you read the newspapers to tell whether they're being ironic or not. Because when it talks about him taking children and schools being closed, well, I'm a bit skeptical about the farm's livestock, actually. But I'm very skeptical about the children being taken and the schools being closed. Um, Once more, maybe the Penarth paper itself would say more. School logbooks may say more. I haven't been back to South Wales for a long time, but maybe next time I'm down there, I'll try and see if there's any evidence for that. But I suspect it may be a little bit of a dramatization, maybe even having, as the later performers do, having a bit of a laugh about it all. However, there's a lot more to this when we look into the individuals involved. We have Scott and Murdoch with the letter writers in Lisbon, but the individual we're going to see here in Penarth is a far more substantial contributor to this story than either of those men. So we're looking at why the gorilla. First of all, gorillas were known at this time. It's a 1840s, 1850s type thing. They come onto the radar of the scientific community, even though, of course, they've been known for centuries before then, as is often the case. These strange beasts are the things of myth and rumor. And then when Western Europeans get there, or Americans or the like, then it suddenly becomes real. So we've got the lowland gorilla in the west of Africa. Now, that's the one that's been, well, they're all in the west, but more towards the coast. That's the type of gorilla that's known in the middle of the century. It's only until round about the turn of the century that we get the mountain gorilla, which is more substantial and even bigger still. Not long afterwards, we have the eastern lowland gorilla. So they range in size from about 5'8" approximately for the Western lowland, about 6 foot. I mean, these are just averages, of course, for the mountain gorilla, and some say as much as 6'6" for the eastern lowland gorilla. And there'd been a famous Belper gorilla hunt in 1867, where in Derbyshire, where there'd been three gorillas had been successfully captured, and they hadn't been. They ran for a number of quite a distance apparently, and gave a real scare to the area. We've got scares about the gorilla in Barry later on, where that again, that's just a rumor, sort of snippet of two lines in the newspapers. In the 23rd of March, and a month later in Tonguinlas, which is the other side of Cardiff, then 21st of April. Tonguinlas there at, supposedly, there's quite a bit of detail about that one, about a gorilla in the woods. So the gorilla in the woods theme is definitely the thing in Wales in 1894. Now, David Morgan is the individual I was getting to, because David Morgan, he is the only witness who stood by his words. There was another individual, which when he was approached by the press, he lived in South Penarth, his surname was Hunter. He denied it when when the press talked to him. We're going to have to rule him out on that basis. There were a pair of women in a churchyard who supposedly saw a large shape looming over the wall, the other side of the churchyard. This was dismissed by a bailiff who said it was his horse. And it is surprising how many of these ghostly and strange experiences are reduced to donkeys in particular. And the donkey is also used in this case too, or ghosts, or sorry, or horses. So we've got David Morgan actually claiming to have seen it. We'll say a little bit more about him as we add some more sources. So gorillas existed. Gorillas were around about. A soldier in London had dressed up as a gorilla and harassed two women in the 1860s. He dressed up in black sheep's fleece over his head as well, and he had a tail, which is again the knowledge of gorillas is a little bit questionable, but you know he managed in terrifying and assaulting two women in that outfit, and that in itself is well, whether he was trying to be a gorilla or trying to be something else, I don't know. He ended up in court for that. So he was caught in Southwark, 1874, sorry, and yeah, he wasn't there this time. Now, let's begin then with the images that were provided by the Evening Express on the 17th of March, Patrick's Day, St. Patrick's Day. And that may well be some kind of relationship there, which we'll again come to soon. So the gorilla as imagined. Okay. And it's one of about four images that were published, sketched in the Evening Express. The other one of the terrified women in the churchyard, the horse, which actually did it, a group of people hunting the gorilla. Yes, we're quite lucky to have those sketches. So we have some visual interpretations or satires of this. Now, David Morgan was a substantial farmer. 200 acres or so, you know, not that large, but uh, Woodland House is where he lived. This is an excerpt from the census, 1891. We see his age there at 54. His two sons living with him, clerical workers, and his wife, a few years older there. She died not long after that, after this time actually. The census was taken anyway. He was an important figure. He'd been chairman of the local board, which is like local government, responsible for all kinds of transportation and health and the like, and the assistance of the poor in that area, Penarth. And on the 14th of March, Morgan said he saw a gorilla, a large, hairy creature he just called a gorilla. Of course, the gorillas would be known by then, were known as a certain thing, so he described it as that. And yeah, between 9 and 10 p.m. He stood by that, unlike Hunter. We know nothing about whether Hunter actually saw anything, but Morgan did. And Morgan's one of those figures in history that is significant, but is not significant enough to leave much of a trace of a record. There's plenty of accounts of his meetings. There's a very big account of his wife's funeral. And you can piece together quite a few things. There are some other famous David Morgans at this time, including the David Morgan retail chain, which had a branch in Penarth and in Cardiff, and a miners champion, David Morgan, who ended up in prison on occasion in the 1890s with his political and union activities. He had a bailiff on the farm. It was not inconsidered. It wasn't a small property by any stretch of the imagination. And when you look back at what happened on his farm, what you could gather from the press, you had sheep being stolen in 1890, towards the end of 1890, some problems with theft. His wife died not long after the census was taken. And his eldest son got married in December of 1893. So you get a little kind of vague family history feel about this. When it came to the Lisbon example, I contacted some individuals and folklore groups and so forth to find out, and they had their own theories and ideas about the Gruagach and the like. I may well consult some family historians in Southeast Wales to see if we can find more about David Morgan. But we have got enough to piece together some potential explanations about what was going on at that time in his mind, if nothing else. Because David Morgan was frightened at times. Obviously, there'd been thefts from his property, and that wasn't the only case. There were responsibilities as the chair and as a member of the local board regarding issues related to unemployment, and which of course could be quite seasonal or based on trade fluctuations, primarily, of course, with the docks. And you don't get many quotes from him, but in the press you do get the feeling that he's not very sympathetic towards the unemployed. He's almost like the opposite of David Morgan, the miners champion, I think, despite sharing the same name. At one stage, he says, well, no one can be unemployed unless they want to be, and being idle for the sake of it. So just to give a feel here of a man he's a farmer, he's got property, he's got concerns about the safety of his property, he's got responsibilities, and maybe this kind of fits in with a fear, and that fear would be of something primitive, and indeed many of the underclass and the lower working classes were seen in such ways. Interestingly, on the 5th of May, 1894, a couple of months after this, the son of David Morgan's bailiff died. His 3-year-old drowned in a 3-foot pool. So the tragedy continued there. In that case, it was quite a difficult time there. I mean, the eldest son's wedding may have been a cause for celebration at the end of the last year, but then that happened. But let's go to Essex. Let's go to Essex, because it's there that we may have a further explanation of David Morgan's experiences. Before then, just a brief aside, that's a very old book from the early 70s. Apes and Angels. Frequently, in caricatures, the Irish were depicted as being simian or being ape-like, and both in the USA and in the UK. This accelerated at times when there were calls for Irish autonomy or home rule. And of course, as we saw from the previous slide, that issue wasn't far away for many concerns at the time. I'm not sure about David Morgan's politics exactly. I'm not going to hazard a guess from what I've heard already, because the Liberal and the Conservative could both be equally concerned about property at that time and the dangers posed by rebels in the Empire. Essex, then. Okay. I was puzzled by this griller. I thought, well, what on earth could have prompted him to think that? And then none of the Welsh papers mentioned what happened in Essex in the same month. They mentioned it, but they didn't mention it in relationship to the Penarth example. I don't know why they didn't. because on the 8th of March, we have the second escape of Mrs. Ward's gorilla. Yeah, Mrs. Ward had a menagerie in Essex, and one of the animals was in Woodham, Mortimer in Essex. Yeah, it had escaped before, was captured, and it went out again. And as you can see from that image from the London Illustrated News, a great source of absolutely quite traumatic images, actually. I think there's some things online where people do, and London Illustrated Police News, rather, images. As you can see, that was eventually shot and died on this occasion, much to Mrs. Ward's disappointment, and according to the Essex newspapers and London newspapers, the great relief of the public. The great error of this poor gorilla was that it went into somebody's house and stole a child's breakfast. And that was the worst thing it did. Anyway. Now, this incident got a lot of attention. It was in the Welsh newspapers, but it appears that they came, well, after Morgan reported seeing the gorilla. And that poses a very tricky question for somebody trying to investigate what actually happens, doesn't it? Because he may well have heard of it from some other source, and maybe there were other materials that came, and not every paper is available, and not every paper has been even kept, let alone on microfilm or hard copy or digitized. Just makes me wonder, did he see it? Did he read about it? What were his movements, and who did he know? Because that was some important story. There were other stories about the gorillas in the press at the time. There was a academic called Gardner who claimed that he could talk and communicate with gorillas. The first gorilla to the USA had arrived on the 6th of January, 1894. Gorillas were in the news, but for it to appear in Penarth in the Roger Moore Woods, well, yeah, what could have made that happen? So, yes, it was an imaginary gorilla. It was indeed phantasmagoric. It was a very aggressive vagrant, okay. But when you go beyond that into the minds of the people or the assumptions, whether they are known individuals like David Morgan or more generally a populace like the population just outside Lisbon, you begin to unveil some of the mentalities and some of the ideas that could be impressing on people at the time. More generally, then, I'd like to conclude with these 2 points. How many times is there an overlap between what you'd call the real strange and the more fanciful strange? Because that's what happened in Lisbon. That man was acting and looked in such a manner, bizarre manner, that he was comprehended in a way that was like supernatural or a monstrosity, unknown creature. And I think this happens in a number of cases, and it, of course, takes on its own permeations in each case. But how many times may we also see the fanciful strange and see it as the real strange? You can swap them round. But there is an interrelationship there that may well explain some strange things, because the real world is strange enough as it is. Secondly, we all know about the effect of media transmission, how a story can spread. But we also need to be aware of how the story can have a local adaptation. And I think that's what happened with the gorilla, if we follow the Essex theory. And Morgan heard about it. But for him, it took on its own life. His wife had died 2 or 3 years previously. In the year previously, his eldest son had married. We can speculate about his state of mind regarding what was happening politically or what was going on in terms of his farm. Maybe that gorilla fitted in very neatly or conveniently there. On a more psychical element, though, what about the death of that bailiff's son, his bailiff's son, a couple of months afterwards? We have this idea of foreshadowing, but again, that's another potential if you take those things into consideration. And I'm reminded, just a couple of books before we go, before I conclude, is that this collection about humanoid encounters refers to a American case of a wild, hairy woman in the USA in 1894, which again is a case of the very real. Again, a case of the very real becoming almost fancifully strange. And another very old book, I'm showing my age here in many ways. This it comes from literary theory and it's spread to study of culture, but the idea of reception, because how do people receive these strange stories? And I'm thinking about David Morgan, obviously, in this case, but more generally, how people kind of co-create the strange by hearing something and then fitting it into their own circumstances. And I think that's another general thing that may well figure in a number of studies and a number of investigations. I forgot my watch. I've no idea how long I've gone on for. So I will find out now oh, there we are. I'll find out now when I get rid of my screen. Thank you all very much.
One of the things I'd like to extend on that is that I was always quite fascinated, and I spent some time talking with Richard Freeman about it, regarding the in France in the 16 and 1700s. There's lots of these king's hunt lists that feature animals that they killed on their travels and in their hunts, kind of like an itinerary of what they killed. Like, we killed 4 hogs today, 2 wolves, and we killed 3 trolls, and those kind of things that have appeared frequently on lists. And one of the perceptions is that they in fact was a hominid that clearly lived under bridges, because they often made nests under themselves in the way that gorillas and chimpanzees do. And of course, they kept themselves in these wet environments, hiding under bridges, and they became almost trophies that the royalty would go and kill. Have you got any thoughts on anything like that?
That's amazing. That is amazing, isn't it? Those fairy trolls are real. Or could have some contact. But yes, the early modern era really gives, doesn't it, something extra to our understanding of these events. And that's why, as a modern historian, I'm quite glad when I find anything that is vaguely kind of peculiar in this animal sense. I mean, I mentioned sea serpents earlier and so forth in the interwar years, but it's always interesting to think about, even further on where there's less room, I suppose, for people's, what they think is a fanciful early modern or medieval imagination to play. But yeah, I would be looking those up and add them to my list of things to try and see, I think. I'm in France anyway.
So I guess before Caroline jumps in with the questions, there is a fair few there. I mean, so the idea of your sea serpents article or your research, what's led to that?
Oh, well, it was an invitation to try and contribute a piece of work that looked at the way in which the coast has been imagined in modern times. And I thought, well, let's look at the interwar years. And obviously, there's a synergy there with the Loch Ness Monster, or his most well-known Loch Ness Monsters in the early 30s. But there was also this whole relationship between people and the sea in between the wars as Britain's power is beginning to recede. And of course, the rise of Nazi Germany combined, of course, with the consequences of the First World War. So it was very much a kind of a contextual study on how the sea serpent and the sea monster in general fits into that. Yeah.
I can imagine that the concept of sea serpents are underwater monsters and the early submarines, might, I guess, play into that too.
Yeah, yeah. You don't need to read it, Christian, because that's a large part of it when it comes out is the whole sea monster thing and submarine thing. Also speedboats, but they're a bit less exciting. They play a part too.
Caroline, I don't mean you to keep you in the background there. I was very fascinated by that. What are our questions this evening from our members that have stayed around and wish to ask Mike some questions?
Yeah, we do have quite a few. So